Good evening. What a joy it is to hear your voices and to sense the enjoyment of each other's company that those sounds imply. I'm Newell Williams, president of Brite Divinity School at Texas Christian University. This is Brite's centennial year. During this year, we have highlighted a number of events that point to distinctive aspects of Brite's heritage and ongoing identity. Tonight's celebration of 50 years of Catholic-Jewish dialogue is one such event, as it pulls together Brite's efforts beginning in the 1990s to increase awareness of the richness of Catholic and Jewish perspectives and experience. We are grateful to those individuals, families, and foundations that have led in these efforts, and this evening, especially grateful to Gates of High Incorporated and Friends of Gates that have made possible this occasion, honoring the memory of Larry Kornbleet and those family members of Stanley and Marcia Kurtz who perished in the Holocaust. Thank you, friends, one and all. No member of the Brite Board of Trustees has been more committed to Brite's efforts to lift up contributions of Catholic and Jewish tradition than Elaine Kellum, TCU, class of 1963, who will introduce tonight's moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Reverend Dr. Sharon E. Watkins serves as General Minister and President of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. When she was elected in 2005, she was the first female head of a mainline denomination. Dr. Watkins served as a missionary in the Congo early in her career, and she served as pastor in Oklahoma, Indiana, and Connecticut. She holds a doctoral degree from Phillips Theological Seminary, a master's degree from Yale Divinity School, and a bachelor's degree from Butler University. Dr. Watkins is the author of Whole, A Call for Unity in Our Fragmented World. In her book, she shares an invitation to live out God's unconditional love to heal divisions and divisiveness in both North America and the global community. At the invitation of President Barack Obama, she preached at the National Prayer Service in Washington, D.C., the day after his first inauguration, and she served a term on his advisory council on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships. Dr. Watkins serves on the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches, and she is chair-elect of the National Council of Churches. Welcome, Dr. Watkins.
Thank you, Elaine Kellum. It is good to be here. President Williams, Dr. Larry Thomas, other distinguished persons in the room, and distinguished ones all. It is great to be here this evening. As General Minister and President of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, I am delighted to be with Brite Divinity School this evening. Brite educates and forms so many of our pastors and leaders in 28 or so denominations. Congratulations on more than 100 years of important work. It's great to be right by the campus of TCU. one of our related universities, going also back more than 100 years. And at University Christian Church, a flagship congregation for us, actively involved in the mission of the church. It's a particular pleasure to be part of this occasion, recognizing 50 years of Nostra Aetate for its significance in opening up not just the Catholic Church, but the rest of us as well to dialogue and encounter, hopefully on the way to better understanding with people of other religious traditions. For disciples of Christ who feel a particular calling to bring down barriers among God's children, who believe that from the very beginning God created us to be one human family, an occasion like this is of particular note. It's an honor to be here with our two distinguished leaders and to have an opportunity to hear from them. So let's get on with the evening and introduce our guests. Mr. Paul Ray, Jr., Chair of the Board of Trustees, Brite Divinity School. Will you begin the introductions?
Thank you, Sharon. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Bishop Brian Farrell, and particular pleasure in that I think I hold the distinction of being the only Roman Catholic to be chair of a disciple seminary. So Bishop Farrell is secretary of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. He was born in Dublin, Ireland, studied for the priesthood with the Legionaries of Christ, and was ordained in 1969. He holds licentiate degrees in philosophy and in theology, and was awarded a doctorate in theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University in 1981. Immediately following that, he began work in the Secretariat of State in the Vatican. For a period of time, he was the director of the Novitiate of the Legionaries of Christ in Connecticut. In 2002, he was appointed the titular bishop of the titular See of Epinay and the secretary of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. He was ordained a bishop in 2003 by Pope John Paul II. And I should also note another, has to be at least somewhat unique coincidence, I guess. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but his brother is here this evening, Bishop Kevin Farrell, and he is the bishop of the Diocese of Dallas. So welcome, and I think I saw the bishop of the Diocese of Fort Worth come in, Bishop Michael Olson. So we're delighted to have you here, and Bishop Farrell particularly delighted that you're here this evening. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce our second guest, Rabbi David Rosen. Welcome. Rabbi Rosen is the International Director of Interreligious Affairs of the American Jewish Committee and its Heilbronn Institute for International Interreligious Understanding. So many difficult words there. Former Chief Rabbi of Ireland and a past chairman of the International Jewish Committee on Interreligious Consultations, he serves on the leadership of various international interreligious bodies. Rabbi Rosen received a papal knighthood in 2005 for his contribution to Jewish-Catholic reconciliation, and in 2010 he was made a Commander of British Empire by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II for his work promoting interfaith understanding and cooperation. Welcome, Rabbi Rosen.
Trying to get, I think I've got it. Okay, the microphone works. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here and being ready to listen to us. Celebrating 50 years of Nostra Aetate, one of the documents of the Second Vatican Council. You will realize that for Catholics, documents of councils are very important. They indicate the principles and the direction in which the life and the teaching of the Church proceed. And they also indicate the limits within which a development can take place. So we're here tonight to celebrate a document that is extremely important in having brought an enormous change into Catholic teaching, into Catholic attitudes, and has meant that we Catholics have had to learn a whole new mindset. And that is basically the theme of my talk this evening. So we're going to do this in alternation. I will speak for a while, then Rabbi Rosen will speak, and then I'll come back and bore you again, and then he will come back and enliven our party here this evening. I want to thank everybody. I feel like I'm coming here to meet many old friends. I have met many of the people in leadership positions of the disciples down the years in my work for Christian Unity. And of course, Rabbi Rosen is a dear friend from the moment that I began to be the vice president of the Holy See's Commission for Relations with the Jewish People. He and I are very good friends. I think I have the unique privilege of having been invited by Rabbi Rosen to a Shabbat dinner. And at a certain point, one of the Hebrew Psalms was sung to the tune of Danny Boy in my honor. So that's one of the many things that have kept us as good friends down the years. Now let me get going on this. I don't want to make it too much of an academic event, so I'll tell you something about the history of the text of Nostra Aetate in my own way. And you all realize that when we think of the Second Vatican Council, we have to put in the first place the enormous and influential, absolutely influential figure of Pope John the 23rd. Pope John wanted to be a parish pastor. Instead of that, his bishop pushed him into serving the church as a diplomat. And so for 10 years, he was apostolic delegate in Turkey, also during the years of the Second World War. And there he managed, with the help of other people, to save many people from deportation, including many Jews. John the 23rd, though, was a very profound spiritual person. So his activism was not just a question of being good and being courageous at a difficult moment. He actually was deeply convinced that there was a huge need for repentance among Christians, among Catholics in particular, because of the treatment that had been given to the Jewish people down the centuries. And he wrote a prayer that I would briefly repeat to you here so that you can understand the depth of his feeling about the harm that had been done. He says, "We are conscious today that many, many centuries of blindness have cloaked our eyes so that we can no longer see the beauty of thy chosen people, nor recognize in their faces the features of our privileged brethren. Forgive us for the curse we falsely attach to their name as Jews. Forgive us for crucifying thee a second time in their flesh, for we know not what we did." John the 23rd came to the papacy very late in life. But that didn't stop him. He was quite active. So at Vespers, on the 25th of January, 1959, in the Basilica of St. Paul's outside the walls, he asked the cardinals and bishops who were there to wait after the Vespers, and he wanted to talk to them. And he said, okay, I'm going to call a council. And apparently there was dead silence. And he jumped up off the chair and says, thank you very much. I take it that your silence means you all agree. And he left. And a few weeks later, he surprised, stunned his own staff when he said to them, by the way, at the council, I want to invite observers from the other churches. And they all froze and thought, we don't even talk to them. So what are we going to do? And somebody remembered that Cardinal Jaeger, who was the Archbishop of Paderborn for many years, had established a very important ecumenical institute, which still continues today, and had written to the Pope after he announced the council to say, we need a body in the Roman Curia to work for promoting Christian unity. So they wrote off to him and they said, how are we going to do this? Inviting observers to the council. And he wrote back and said, you have Father Bear over there in Rome, put him up in an office and he will know what to do. I'll pay for it. And that was the beginning of the Council for Promoting Christian Unity, of which I am the secretary. Now, the fact of the matter is that this Cardinal Bea, this Father Bea, became a cardinal very soon. Why? Because John the 23rd realized, here is the man who's going to do something. He's going to bring very important, delicate subjects onto the agenda of the council. So Cardinal Bea was entrusted by John to bring to the council the theme of Christian unity, the theme of relations with the Jewish people, and the question of religious liberty, religious freedom. And he did an excellent job. He worked hard, he was dogged, he was courageous, he was intelligent, he had around him, he formed a team, and for 4 years they struggled to get these points through the council. Now, very briefly, the good intentions of Pope John would never have gotten anywhere because he died after the first session of the council. They would never have gotten anywhere without Paul VI. And some of you may remember that even during the period of the council, he wrote that famous encyclical Ecclesiam Suum. And the purpose of it was to inspire the church to come out of any self-centeredness and to realize that it exists in the world to serve the world, and therefore to be in dialogue with every aspect of the human condition, with every culture, with every religion, with every scientific question that comes up, with every moment of human history. And this was inspirational, and it has much to do with the eventual success of the Second Vatican Council. Now, we have, therefore, a desire on the part of the popes and a commitment on the part of Paul VI to bring the question of relations with the Jewish people onto the council. It wasn't easy. And text after text were presented to the commissions, to the theological commission, and they were discussed and changed, adapted. All kinds of amendments were made. It was a struggle. But it wasn't just a struggle within the council. It was also a struggle in public opinion. You had people in the council, bishops, who were completely against any openness to the Jewish people or to anybody else. You had the bishops, many from Middle Eastern countries, Islamic countries, who were afraid of any mention of the Jews. You had reaction from governments in Arab countries. They wondered, why is the church changing its opinion now about the Jews when we are in a struggle with Israel, which had just come into existence? And you had many very conservative bishops who couldn't see that the church had to be in any way in dialogue with others. We have the truth, and therefore we go forward and we do our thing. It wasn't easy, and it is a tribute truly to Cardinal Bea that in the course of the 4 years he educated so many of the bishops to understand that not only for historical reasons, in other words, the history of the teaching of contempt for the Jewish people that had been prevalent almost from the beginning in the church, not just because of the Shoah, the Holocaust, which was made possible by that anti-Judaism that existed in the cultural milieu of our Christian societies in Europe, but also for theological reasons that were being slowly discovered and had been in a process of development, as many of you will know, from the 30s and 40s and 50s in the past century. So you had a biblical ressourcement, which is a return to the sources, a study, a more scientific study, a more structural study of biblical texts and the whole history of Israel, the history of salvation. You had a liturgical renewal, which was rediscovering the Jewish roots of our liturgy, our feasts, our celebrations. And therefore, for reasons of justice and for reasons of theology, a change in attitude was essential. And frankly, our celebration of the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate is an act of gratitude to God that at that moment in our history, our church was able to reflect on itself, examine itself, and come to a clearer understanding of something that is absolutely fundamental to our faith, and that is its origins in Judaism. Jesus was a Jew. The disciples were Jewish. The traditions of the Jewish world were the formative elements in the life of Jesus. His preaching was all about the kingdom announced to the patriarchs, continuously renewed through the prophecies, through the prophets. We will never understand Jesus if we take him out of that climate, out of that context. And we will never understand our scriptures, the New Testament, if we separate them from the Old Testament. To the point that the Pontifical Biblical Commission has written to say that our New Testament, without the Old Testament, would be an unintelligible book. It would be a plant without roots. So this is the first important thing that we must say. This was the atmosphere, this was the climate in which Nostra Aetate developed. So let me try to say very briefly, to remind you, what does Nostra Aetate? Now, we're concentrating here this evening on the fourth section. I should have said this at the beginning. The fourth section of Nostra Aetate. It also has important things to say about the relationship of the Catholic Church to other world religions. And without underestimating the importance of that, we are here celebrating our relationship with the Jewish people. So, what does it say? It says that by emphasizing the unique bonds that bind Christians and Jews in the history of salvation, the Jewish roots of Christianity are an essential part of our understanding of our own faith. The Jewishness of Jesus and the first disciples, it strongly affirms that what happened in the passion and death of Jesus cannot be blamed upon, quote, all the Jews then living, nor upon the Jews of today. There is no collective guilt in the death of Jesus. It affirms the permanent validity of God's covenant with the Jewish people. And this, for me, is the essential point. We Catholics and all Christians have to confront this question, the validity of the covenant, which, in St. Paul's words, is never revoked. Therefore, Christianity has not replaced Judaism. In consequence, Nostra Aetate calls for a purification in catechetics and preaching, and we must avoid in our teaching anything that undermines the unique bond between Christians and Jews. And it also absolutely rejects hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone. So this is basically a short introduction to the text of Nostra Aetate 4. Less than 700 words, 15 sentences in Latin, that has brought an enormous change in our mentality, in our attitude, in our practice. But let me also say, in the way we understand our faith. We Christians need our Jewish roots in order to understand who we are. This is immensely important. So I leave it at that for the moment.
So let me too open with thanks of this very generous, gracious invitation to be with you here this evening, celebrating this milestone, specifically within Catholic-Jewish relations, but as has already been made by Dr. Watkins in her introduction, with ramifications for the whole of, not only the whole of the Christian-Jewish relationship, but even for interfaith relationships beyond. I must particularly acknowledge Red Goldstein's role in getting us here this evening. Quite a remarkably indefatigable and determined individual with clearly a very, even with the name Red, essentially he can also be referred to as Gold, clearly golden intentions and golden aspirations, and very wise man who knows how to be able to catch his quarry. Bishop Farrell told me, I hear from this gentleman, Mr. Goldstein, that you've agreed to speak at Brite Divinity School. And I said, I heard from Mr. Goldstein that you had agreed to speak at Divinity School. But there we are. The Almighty blessed him with this capacity to be able to bring us here together. And of course, I also give special thanks to Bishop Kevin Farrell, whose initiative brought us to Dallas, that enabled us to be in Fort Worth this evening. Following on from Bishop Brian's comments and his insights into the significance of Nostra Aetate, let me add, even though he did mention in passing, but allow me to belabor the point a little bit, of the importance of us having historical context for serious reflection. It is a mark of how far we have come in Jewish-Christian relations that most young Christians today have no conception of how poisoned, toxic, vitiated the relationship between Jews and Christians was throughout the vast majority of history. And this, of course, goes back to the very dawning of our relationship, or lack thereof. No, it's to the dawning of our relationship, because in fairness, it is clear that there was a significant reality within Jewish life, Christianity having begun as part and parcel of the Jewish community at large, at a time when there were fervent messianic expectations, and where a group amongst those expectant Jews were convinced that they had come across the person who really was the embodiment of that hope. And that was therefore the beginning of the emergence of their faith. For their contemporary Jews, it was not so much a rejection of the personality as much of seeing the context as not having changed, but in fact, in some respects, having worsened, that led to their skepticism with regards to those particular claims. But as the parting of the ways emerged, something more destructive took place. And it was to some extent embodied in the personality of Marcion, with a famous heresy in which he proposed that the Jews had served their purpose in bringing about the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and therefore were no longer relevant or necessary, and therefore the whole scriptures that dealt with the history of the Jewish people that Christians call the Old Testament should be done away with, and the only scriptures that should be matter were the New Testament. Marcion was rejected as a heretic by the church, and yet in reality that's exactly what happened. Not that the Hebrew Bible was rejected, but the Hebrew Bible was no longer seen in any authenticity and in of itself, but only purely as the degree to which it therefore animated the New Testament, to which it provided a foundation for the Christian experience. And therefore the Jewish people in itself no longer had any validity or meaning. This to some extent then posed the profound theological question: if the Jews only existed in order to facilitate the Christian dispensation, then why should the Jews survive? It was the brilliance of St. Augustine that came up with the answer, which was, they remained precisely in their homelessness and even in their suffering to testify to what happens to you when you reject the Christian dispensation. Therefore, to remain essentially a witness of Christian truth. Now, that is that mindset which to some extent had already been anticipated in some of the writings, very hostile writings towards the Jews that you find in John Chrysostom in particular and other church fathers, nevertheless facilitated a very natural move to seeing the Jews as the enemies of God, and even then as being in league with the devil. And if anything bad happened, and especially in a world in which, generally speaking, most people didn't come across any other than themselves. Most people didn't move outside their villages, let alone outside their towns or outside their countries. The ones who came in, because generally they were being invited in to be able to help develop the societies, and then when the barons and those in power decided they were no longer convenient, especially when they had incurred debts, expelled them and they had to move on, the only other you tended to encounter was the Jew. And therefore, in that medieval world, there was a natural tendency to be able to blame anything untoward or unexpected on those different from oneself. And therefore, if there was the Great Plague or a Black Death or anything terrible, it was bound to have been the fault of the Jews. But this, as I've said and as I'm implying, was not simply a sociological phenomenon. It had this theological veneer. And attitudes towards the Jews of expressing this idea that Bishop Farrell mentioned of the teaching of contempt were often the very language of popes and of community leaders, and they were the language of Martin Luther, whose language on the Jews is some of the most virulent and some of the most poisonous. And therefore it prepared a mentality amongst Christians of various places, times, towards the Jew, which not only just disparaged them, but demonized them, dehumanized them, culminating in that ultimate tragedy of the Shoah. The Shoah, of course, was not a Christian plan of action, God forbid. In fact, I agree entirely with Pope Benedict XVI's description of it as a pagan initiative. But it was a pagan initiative which ultimately might have probably sought to target Christianity itself. But it was a pagan initiative that could only work to the degree that it did, because the soil had been tilled by those centuries of demonization and dehumanization. The Shoah was not a Christian enterprise, but it was perpetrated by mostly baptized Christians in ostensibly Christian lands. And that was the enormous power, the enormous sense of responsibility in its wake that served as a galvanization, an enormous incentive on the part of some elements within the churches to a cheshbon nefesh, to a reckoning of the soul, to a process of teshuvah. Teshuvah in the full meaning of the word, not of repentance, but of returning not only to God, returning to their own roots, to the essential common patrimony, to use the language of Nostra Aetate, that binds Jews and Christians together. The most significant individual already mentioned in this regard who embodies that particular process was John the 23rd, but he was not alone. There were, of course, many righteous Christians who saved Jews in the Shoah, born of their intuitive and profound understanding of the nobility of the authentic message of their religious heritage. But the wounds were profound, and I would say the wounds still remain in many places in the world. The Shoah was, of course, overwhelmingly a Jewish tragedy, not exclusively a Jewish tragedy, but overwhelmingly a Jewish tragedy. But it was, as I have said, a Christian scandal. And it was therefore a call to Christians to be able to seriously examine what were those toxic elements that had to be addressed. And it wasn't only the Shoah, as Bishop Farrell has also mentioned, but definitely the most profound impact came from the Shoah. And therefore it was significantly those who understood the fullest impact of that tragedy, that there were major force in galvanizing the church to examine its own relationship with the Jewish people. Part of what is so stunning about Nostra Aetate, Clause 4, indeed, of Nostra Aetate, is that it is the only Nostra Aetate as a whole, and in particular in relation to Section 4, is the only document to come out of the Council, the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, that does not make any reference to pre-conciliar documentation on the parts of popes or councils, but goes right back to New Testament sources and uses its only source of inspiration, a quote from Romans, where Paul speaks of the gifts of God to the Jewish people, who are the covenant, the promise, etc., etc. Dr. Eugene Fisher, one-time Secretary for Ecumenical Relations of the United States Council Conference of Catholic Bishops, pointed out that this verse in Greek could be translated, and probably was mostly translated, or certainly understood by Christians throughout the generations, as theirs were the covenant, the promises, etc., etc. The very fact that it is translated in a presence was in itself a dramatic statement on the part of the council. But in going back to Romans and in going back to this text as the first ever, and this was its remarkable thing, maybe, thank God, it was the first ever, because had there been previous documents and statements on the parts of popes and councils that reflected the commonplace attitude that prevailed before those 2,000 years, then it would be even more complex for Nostra Aetate to have emerged as it did. But because there had never, ever been a statement of popes or councils on the relationship to the Jewish people, this text could go right back to the source and, as it were, say, we are taking off now where Paul left off. It's time to do a more serious business of examining our relationship to the Jewish people. And what's so remarkable about Nostra Aetate is not necessarily what it says, but what it facilitated. And not so much the statements that sometimes, especially on a Jewish part, a great deal is made of, and I'm not minimizing their significance. The fact that Nostra Aetate section 4 emphasizes that Jews are not guilty for the death of Jesus as a particular collective, neither at the time nor in perpetuity, was not a new statement. It was already declared in the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century. The fact, of course, that people had ignored what the Council of Trent had said, or even many church leaders, and had preached as if they were unaware of it, and maybe they were, is another matter, and therefore it certainly was very important that Nostra Aetate clarified and reiterated that particular position, but it was nothing new in essence. The fact that the covenant between God and the Jewish people had not been abrogated was also not in itself new. Because, in effect, even if you say the Jews remain to testify to the truth of Christianity, you are saying that covenant remains, but you are understanding its continuity in a very pejorative and a negative sense. What was remarkable about Nostra Aetate was its positive attitude towards the Jewish people. To affirm that any presentation of the Jewish people to be seen as rejected or accursed, or therefore replaced as such, was wrong, and that the Jewish people is not cursed or condemned, but still beloved and a positive part, therefore, of the divine economy implicit within Nostra Aetate. That was the remarkable beginning of the revolution, because when you say they are not rejected and they are not cursed, but they're still part of God's plan for the world, then you understand the covenant in a positive sense. And then if you understand it positively, you have to say, well, what does that mean? And how do I understand, therefore, the role of the Jewish people? And what does this demand of me as a result? So that was the small beginning that turned into this wonderful stream, this glorious river, this amazing sea of new relationship between Jews and Catholics and Christians at large. We must give credit to the World Council of Churches for having been the first body to refer to Christianity as a sin against God and man, immediately after the Second World War. But when it declared that anti-Semitism was a sin against God and man, it still combined that with a hope that Jews would see the error of their ways and ultimately become good Christians. Nostra Aetate was the beginning of a process in which the Catholic Church acknowledged and affirmed respect for the integrity of the Jewish people. And it was followed by a number of important documents that came out of Bishop Farrell's Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews that further elaborated in that. The guidelines in 1974, the notes on preaching and teaching catechesis in 85, the document on the Shoah. We remember important also documents from other church documents under the imprimatur of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger from the Pontifical Biblical Commission, affirming the divine plan that the Jewish people not acknowledge Jesus. An amazing statement to be able to come out from such a high level of the Catholic Church, that their faith and their anticipation is not in vain, that the integrity of Scripture for the Jewish people, the way Jews understand the text, needs to be respected. This was, of course, affirmed even in previous documents. But of course, the man who took the Jewish-Catholic relationship to new heights, and indeed with impact for the Christian world at large, was John the 23rd, who understood, almost paradoxically, coming from behind the Iron Curtain, the language of Madison Avenue of the need for advertising, and the power, therefore, of the visual image, and a recognition that as important as documents are, most people don't read them, and today even more so in our world, very many people don't read at all. And the visual image can have that impact. And his visit to the synagogue, the great synagogue in Rome, in 1986, his embrace of Rabbi Toaf, the chief rabbi of Rome, his reference to the Jewish people as a dearly beloved elder brother of the church, of the original covenant, never broken, never to be broken, impacted upon millions, maybe billions in our world, sent a very clear message that was in effect the essence of Nostra Aetate that we are celebrating today. And his visit was followed up by his historic pilgrimage to the Holy Land, facilitated by the establishment of full diplomatic relations between Israel and the Holy See, which I was privileged to be one of the small team that negotiated it. And that his visit to Israel had an enormous impact on especially the Jewish community in Israel, but I would say globally. But in order to be able to visit, as I said, it was important for those relations to have to be established. They were significant too. Many people in the Catholic world, and certainly in the Jewish world, suspected that if the church did not have diplomatic relations with Israel, it somehow still didn't think the idea of a re-established sovereign Jewish polity in its ancestral homeland was quite kosher, if I may mix my religious metaphors. And for the establishment of full diplomatic relations was not just a diplomatic act. It was, in effect, an affirmation of Nostra Aetate. And his visit to Israel, showing full respect for Israel's highest elected officials, affirmed that even further. But most dramatic for Israelis were his visit to Yad Vashem and to the Kotel, to the Western Wall. Most Israelis have never met a modern Christian. As strange as that may sound to you, because we love to travel, because we're encircled in a rather hostile environment and like to get out of it, and maybe because the Wanderlust is in our blood after so many years having wandered around the world, we love to travel. But when we travel abroad and meet non-Jews, we tend to meet non-Jews as non-Jews, not as modern Christians. And therefore, we tend still to carry the baggage of our perception of Christianity as a hostile force. And therefore, even though anybody in the know and well-educated was aware of dramatic changes that had taken place in the Christian world, I won't say this had somehow been internalized into the kishkas, into the innards of the Jewish communities, and especially in Israel, where most Israelis, as I say, are far away from such matters and encounters and opportunities. But to see the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, at Yad Vashem, at the Jewish Holocaust Memorial, in tearful solidarity with Jewish suffering, to know of his own childhood and his own travails, to know of how he saved Jewish children as a novice, and of how after the Shoah he returned Jewish children who had been taken in by Catholic families and even baptized and still insisted that they be returned to their Jewish families. That blew Jewish minds in Israel to read these stories, to discover these realities. To see him at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, putting there the text of a prayer he had composed for 2 weeks earlier for a liturgy of repentance of the Vatican, asking God's forgiveness for sins committed against Jews down the generations, made it patently clear to the Jewish people that here was not only a great friend of the Jewish people, but here was a man who embodied a revolution, nothing less than a revolution, that had taken place within the Christian world. And if it had been up to the Jews, we would have canonized John Paul II long before the Catholic Church had done it. And he was succeeded by Pope Benedict XVI, who perhaps pointed out with his own wisdom and his own insight and his own sense of humor, which many people who never met him, or many people who never had the opportunity of a conversation with him were completely unaware of, mentioned that even to refer to the Jewish people as the elder brother of the church might not be the best language, because if you read the Bible, the elder brother doesn't normally come out very well of the story. And therefore, he suggested reference to fathers in faith. There was also a very important message, because you're saying our parents sustain us. They provide that sustenance by which we are able to live. That goes back, of course, to the metaphor from Paul that's used in Nostra Aetate of the church being the wild olive branches grafted onto the essential olive tree. And not suggesting, and no longer understanding, that those grafts had been grafted on and there was nothing else but the grafted olive tree. No, it's been grafted on and there is still that vital, vibrant olive tree, which is still the Jewish people. And now we have a pope who, apart from the first pope, since Peter, there has never been a pope who's known the Jewish people as well as this one. And who, when he was cardinal in Buenos Aires, opened up his cathedral for Holocaust commemorations and visited synagogues and celebrations of the Jewish festivals, who's written a book with a rabbi, who has affirmed not only in the language of John Paul II that the Jewish religion is intrinsic to the very nature of the Catholic and Christian affirmation, and that therefore the relationship with the Jewish people for a Christian should be like no other. This is not to minimize the interfaith relationships that we should have, but you cannot compare parentage or siblinghood to reaching out to other families, as important as reaching out to other families are. Pope Francis had even spoken of a complementarity. He said how we must and we may learn from one another. This is an incredible transformation that is comparable to nothing in human history. This is not just hyperbole. Attitudes can change, but to have seen somebody yesterday as condemned, rejected, in league with the devil, the most odious and despicable of peoples, and to see it now today as dearly beloved, brother or parent, but of a covenant that lives and is vital and vibrant and serves and nurtures Christian identity, and something to treasure and to deepen. There is nothing comparable to that. And it is to say thank you to God for his mercies and for his miracles that are embodied in that transformation ushered in by Nostra Aetate, that we are here to celebrate it this evening on its 50th anniversary. Thank you.
Rabbi David, is there anything left to say? Thank you very much. I do think that you'll all agree that there's hardly any Catholic who would understand the inside workings of the Church since Nostra Aetate and in this field of relations with the Jewish people. But there are one or two more points that I would pay some attention to. But before that, Rabbi David mentioned Pope John Paul II, and I have had the tremendous gift and grace of having worked with him for most of his pontificate. I started working in the Secretariat of State in 1981 and finished in 2002 when he got rid of me and sent me to the Council for Christian Unity. But in the year 2000, I was in charge of a small group of people that helped him to prepare his visit to Israel. And we worked for weeks. We spent hours and hours and hours with him, preparing what he wanted to say, how he wanted to say it, putting together the text. And naturally, you've got to remember, English was not his language, and so the text had to be developed in a way that he could say exactly what he wanted. Well, we worked hard and we were all exhausted before the trip. And I remember 2 or 3 days before the trip sitting in my office and thinking, oh, thank goodness, everything is ready. We only have to send it off now for the press office and the other people that need to know, the radio and the television and so on and so forth. We have all the text ready. And the phone rang, and it was Archbishop Dziwisz, his secretary, and he says, oh, by the way, the Pope wants to change his speech at Yad Vashem, the memorial. And I felt myself exhausted. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, we only have 2 days. How are we going to do this? And then he said, yes, the Pope has been reading at the end of the first paragraph where it says that he remembers his neighbors, his Jewish neighbors who did not survive. He wants you to change that and say, I remember my Jewish friends and neighbors. That was it. In the first moment, there was just my own relief that we didn't have to do a whole lot of work. But then I thought, here he is, he's up there in his room, reading the speeches, getting ready, and he's thinking, these were not just my neighbors, these were my friends. And we know, we've all met, Rabbi Rosen would know better, but I've also met Jerzy Kluger, who was one of his school friends. And after being in the concentration camp at Dachau, had survived, and he had the number tattooed here on his arm. But throughout all the adventures of his life, he ended up living in Rome. And so there was another personal memory is that when I was a student in Rome in the early 60s, I met Jerzy Kluge. Nobody ever heard of Cardinal Wojtyła in Poland. I had never heard of him. But he said to me, you know, the Pope made some new cardinals a few weeks ago. One of them is a Polish friend of mine. He would make a great Pope. And that was in the early 60s. Somebody I had never heard of. And yet, in the course of time, that cardinal became our great Pope and one who has contributed so much to the Catholic-Jewish relationship. Now, I mean, we can't be here forever, but there is one point I really want to make before we end, and I think it's important. It's important for us Catholics, it's important for our Jewish brothers and sisters, but I think it's important for all Christians. And it's something that needs to be reflected on very deeply. And it is that a very sensitive issue. If Jesus is the only one mediator, the one and only Savior, as Christians must hold, and if, on the other hand, God has not revoked the covenant with his people, given through the law and the prophets, do we have a mission to convert the Jews? Do I have to try to bring Rabbi Rosen into my community? This is a profound difficulty for Christians, and it needs a great deal of attention. There have been enormous discussions around this after Nostra Aetate, and we're now in the 50th anniversary. On the 40th anniversary, 10 years ago, there was a huge discussion because Cardinal Avery Dulles, the American, very esteemed intellectual, resurfaced with the idea that the covenant wasn't really still in effect. The covenant with the Jewish people wasn't still in effect, and therefore Christians did have a mission. Well, the reaction was hugely vociferous, and the debate went on and on. The Catholic Bishops' Conference here in the United States in 2009, through the office, its doctrinal office and its ecumenical office, they wrote a document in which they were very ambiguous about the question of a mission to convert the Jewish people. But the reaction was such that Cardinal George at the time took the text and it was revised. This issue is always present. It is also the issue that lies behind much of the polemics that we've had over the Good Friday prayer. Most of you will perhaps understand what I'm talking about. In our liturgy, we have on Good Friday a series of intercessions, one of which is for the conversion of the Jews. And, well, I don't want to get into the whole question, but it was actually worse than that. It was for the conversion of the perfidious Jews, a word that John the 23rd already in 1962 completely took out of the liturgy. But the prayer was also not very respectful, to put it in mild terms. It asked God to enlighten the mind and the heart of the Jews so that they would recognize Christ as their Lord. With the renewal of the liturgy after the council, these prayers were changed. What happened then was that Pope Benedict extended the possibility for some communities to use the old rite. So through the back door, the old prayer came back in. So then we had to have a renewal of the prayer, a revision of the prayer. The revision was not as clear and as acceptable as we would have perhaps wished, but certainly in the ordinary rite of our Good Friday prayers, the prayer, I think, is quite respectful of the mission of the Jewish people in themselves, and not only because of our Christian understanding of how we would wish them to be. Think of it this way: to Jewish eyes, a mission to convert Jews, if it were successful, would lead to the extinction of the Jewish people and the Jewish religion. The question, therefore, becomes hugely important, and it also becomes very sensitive if we think of the sad history of how they have been treated. So, how do we come to try to understand our attitude to this question of the mission? My old boss at the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jewish People was Cardinal Kasper. Cardinal Kasper has worked as one of the most renowned theologians in our church in recent times. He has worked much on this question and has written a lot about it. He points out that if we think of mission as a call to conversion, which it is, we go on mission because we want to bring people into the church to recognize Christ, there is a solid reason why the church doesn't have an institutional mission to convert the Jews. And what is it? It is that conversion means turning away from false idols, turning to the true God. But is it not the true God who has revealed himself to the Jewish people in the first place? Therefore, the whole concept of conversion here is not appropriate. And this is exactly what Nostra Aetate is saying. They, the Jews, are the original witnesses to the self-revelation of the living God in the history of salvation. And therefore Kasper concluded there's plenty of room for dialogue, but there is no room for a Catholic institutionalized mission to convert the Jews. So Catholics have no desire to absorb the Jewish faith into Christianity, and so put an end to the specific Jewish witness to God and to his work in our human history. And this is not just a question of a strategic respect for a faith that, as Rabbi David reminded us, is intrinsic to us. It's not extrinsic like the other world religions. It's intrinsic to our own understanding of ourselves. The continuing validity of the role of the Jewish people in the divine history of salvation is, in my view, the heart of Nostra Aetate. And it is on that basis that we say that we are two subjects of God's providential action in our human history. For almost 2,000 years, we have ignored this complementarity, this interdependence. After Nostra Aetate, we have a huge task to theologically develop the understanding of our relationship. And this is something that slowly but surely, many of our theologians, many of our theological faculties, our seminaries are developing, but much too slowly. We, therefore, accepting this, also recognize something, a concrete or practical implication. If we understand that the covenant with the people of Israel is not revoked by God, then there is no basis on which a Christian can be anti-Semite. Anti-Semitism is a negation of ourselves as well as an offense to our Jewish brothers and sisters. We have, therefore, here, as we said in the beginning, that in Nostra Aetate, at the time of the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church made what some people have called a U-turn in its attitude, in its understanding, and laid the basis for a whole new relationship with our Jewish brothers and sisters. We are making progress in understanding the newness of this relationship, but we still have so much more to investigate together, to work out together. And this is the challenge that I think all of us, Catholics and Christians of all denominations, should feel as a challenge that God gives us in this time. I will end with one simple word, and it is, I can't find it here, the text, but on the 50th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Pope John Paul II wrote a very sensitive, very deeply felt letter in which he says Catholics and Jews, all Christians and Jews, are meant to be a blessing to the world. But in order to be that, they have to be a blessing to one another. Let us finish thinking that this is the challenge that we all face.
Well, Bishop Bryan said, let us finish, and probably I shouldn't have still got up, because we have indeed, I think, heard the most important things that needed to be said. But as I've been given the double honor of addressing you a second time, I will be brief in trying to make certain additional observations. Let me first of all say that I think that in the transformation in Christian-Jewish relationships, there has been a very blessed double act of Protestants and Catholics. Protestantism, through different denominations, really led the way, both in America and internationally, of moving away from a proselytizing missionary proselytizing attitude towards the Jews, and there were pioneers out of many different streams. I'm particularly familiar, because of my own English background, with the important stride made by people like Travers Hereford and James Parks and others. And in fact, there were already engagements taking place due to Protestant initiative, when within the Catholic Church this was still verboten and not an acceptable interreligious engagement before Nostra Aetate. But Nostra Aetate not only therefore transformed this, but when it comes from an institution that has a magisterium, has a pope at its head who is being given a lead, the transformation can be far more impactful than it can be, I would say, even certainly within the Jewish community, let alone in Protestant communities, where we celebrate our diversity, which I think is a great thing. And I'm not sure that I would want us to be able to have a papacy as far as the Jewish community is concerned, yet nevertheless there is no question that when an institution that has a papacy and has such a hierarchical structure makes a decision that is so momentous as something of Nostra Aetate, its impact is far beyond perhaps any other segment of the wonderfully diverse religious world can expect to achieve in that regard. And the pace at which that change went ahead is remarkable. What is 50 years in terms of 2,000 years? And today, in certain places, and most notably, the most greatest success story is the United States, you have over 30 institutions for Christian Jewish studies, some of them within other bodies and overwhelmingly within Catholic institutions, but of course not only. But of course I'm here at a remarkable institution in itself that, thanks to Mr. Goldstein, I have now been able to get to know, and you yourselves are a remarkable testimony of that new spirit and of the diversity, not only with respect for the Jewish roots of Christianity that you have within your own faculty and within your own courses, but also an outreach to other religions and other manifestations of God's presence in our world. So this is just an opportunity for me to thank you and pay tribute to you. My last comments would simply be that Nostra Aetate, as has already been indicated, in order to be able to deal with opposition coming from various sources, whether for political or theological reasons, had to find a mechanism by which it could address this historically neuralgic relationship with the Jewish people. And it did so by expanding its mandate to address the relationship of the church with other religions. And that is what, in effect, is the title of the document of Nostra Aetate, the church's relations to other religions. By addressing its relationship to Islam, to a large extent, it took the sting out of the tail of Muslim opponents who were worried that this was going to be some kind of political statement. By addressing its relationships with the churches of the East, it brought on board those bishops from the East who saw this as an opportunity in terms of their own engagement with their own particular society. So by presenting a document that related to other religions, the need and the obligation to address the relationship with the Jewish people and the very roots of Christianity was facilitated. I think there's something far more significant in this than simply the wisdom of a constructive tactical approach. There is a statement implicit in this process, which is that if such a toxic relationship, such a poisoned relationship, as has been historically that between Christians and Jews, can be transformed in such a blessed and constructive one, there is no relationship, how problematic and how vitiated, whether it's by politics or even by theology, that cannot be transformed. Every relationship with religious communities and communities of various diversity can become healed and can become a blessing and can become, indeed, as Bishop Bryan quoted John Paul II, as a blessing for humankind. And indeed, this is the second aspect of that broadening, that broad-based significance of the Nostra Aetate Declaration. And that is that in addressing the world, we are being called upon to address the world. We are being called, indeed, to be a blessing to one another, but to live up to that responsibility as the children of Abraham, to be a blessing to our world, and to find ways in which we can work together to heal and to bring greater understanding and respect and indeed love where we live and throughout the world at large. May we be worthy of this charge.